Oh, so glad to be actually somewhere in person. This is my first conference out in the public rather than Zoom. I've been Zooming now for several years. I guess there's probably many of you the same way. So it's good to be back and seeing real faces and real people and emotion in an audience. So first I'd like to thank Jessica. It was a great, absolutely fabulous presentation. Had several of the things that we'll talk about will be in there as well. I am Jonthan Crabtree. I'm at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm currently helping lead the board of the CoreTrustSeal along with Hervé here. And unfortunately, Ingrid is out, will not be here today, but we'll try to forge on through without Ingrid. She keeps us straight, so y'all might have to help keep us in line. So we're going to talk about three things here. One is a new version of the seal. We revise that every 3 years. We'll talk about that and how we've taken community input and peer feedback and edited that, as well as look at the CoreTrustSeal in the bigger context, things that are going on in the community now. Hervé will talk about that a little bit, and we'll talk a little bit about network of trustworthy digital repositories. And since we are a peer review organization and we are a part of the community, we want all the feedback we can, we're going to turn the questions around and get input from you to tell us what we need to do. So that's what we're here to do. So as we've talked a little bit about, there's a couple different certification standards out there. We're going to talk about the CoreTrustSeal in this presentation, but there's also the 16363 and the Nestor out there as well. But what makes CoreTrustSeal a little different, and what are the objectives of that? We're looking at the heart of the matter. It's really hard for a lot of organizations to go through those 100 plus things in ISO 16363. So how do you boil those down into the core, what that core is? And it's a tenuous balance between what's required by every single archive and what's required by your specific archive. So there's lots of work there. But basically the idea is that we want to give a certification model where data producers, funding bodies, and consumers can all find that they trust that the data is taken care of appropriately. So the backgrounds of this, that things were being found on the internet. We want things to be discoverable. We want things to be accessible. They want them in a usable format into the future, now and into the future, however long you say you're going to preserve those objects, right? And we want them reliable and some sort of persistent identifier. This sounds a lot like FAIR, right? I mean, some of the letters are identical. We're walking over those. But the CoreTrustSeal is an enabler of FAIR in a temporal timescale, over time. It's a trusted repository. Repositories need to be trusted in order to hold FAIR data over time. We'll talk about that a little more in the presentation. So a little brief history. Jessica mentions this a little bit, but the data seal of approval was there, as well as the WDS certification for regular members of the World Data Systems, and that came together during an RDA a working group there, so we're really closely tied with RDA, and out of that was born this CoreTrustSeal. They boiled down all of that stuff into what are the core requirements there. It is as I was saying, it is a peer organization. We're all volunteers. We're here to help. We actually need people on this board. We need people as reviewers. The heart of this are the assembly of reviewers. That's where everything comes from. As you get certified as a CoreTrustSeal repository, you nominate someone to be in this assembly of reviewers, and then you start reviewing your peers. So it's all about helping each other. While it is a certification standard, it is all about community and how we can help each other and work together to become a better preservation society. So, as I said before, it's a not-for-profit. It is a community-based, very strong ties with the Research Data Alliance. It's a global, with over 100 repositories around the world that are now certified through CoreTrustSeal. It's domain agnostic, so it doesn't matter which domain. And many people ask, well, how can a social scientist review a repository for geomagnetism, right? Well, we're thinking about the core here. What are the core? How do you manage those digital objects? And it turns out that having a different perspective is very valuable because you always learn something from your peers. And sometimes that really, really helps the process. Now, we do have a process where multiple people look at it, so you might not always have someone outside your domain. You may also have someone in your domain. It's basically a two-step process where the first step is inside your assessment. You start looking at your repository, and it says 16 requirements here, but I always say there's 17 because there's a beginning one. There's an R0 or a very beginning where you describe your repository, you describe that designated community that's so important. Those components are all done in-house. And if you have all your documentation, as Jessica said, that's easy. It's just assembling all those documents. So you have a ingest document, you have a preservation plan, you have a mission statement. You just point to them, put them on your sheet, and it's easy, right? But I will tell you, I've gone through lots of audits for repositories. We started years ago with Drambora, if anybody remembers the Drambora audit. And as soon as you start, you get through, you say, I can knock this out. I'm going to go right through these things, and I'm going to pick them all off. And you get to number 2 and say, well, I ain't got that. Ugh. Stop. Let's go get somebody. Pull somebody in the room, figure it out. Now you get to number 6. Ooh, I don't have that one either, so we got to get that one. So getting that stuff together does take time. If you have it all together, it's very simple. But pulling it together takes time. So all of these things, things like CoreTrustSeal or RAM, as it was talked about earlier, that lets you go through and look at your organization. Anytime you're looking inside your organization and seeing what you're doing and then comparing it to your peers in some sort of benchmark, it always makes you better. And that's what we're looking to do. So once you've done that, it gets into the system where 2 of the experts from other certified repositories take a look at that. They go through it and give you suggestions on how to improve or whether you're doing really, really well. And then that comes to the CoreTrustSeal board, who has the final say. And it's never one time, maybe one time, I don't know. It might be a few that win one time, but almost everyone has a few comments. This could be better. And we're really trying to help the repository out because in the end, this is going to be public. You're getting ready to put this document on the website and all your designated community is going to see it. So we don't want someone to publish something on that website that says that you do A, B, and C when you only do A and C and you're not really doing B very well. So we help them out do that. So those certifications are for a 3-year period, and then you have to have a re-review after that 3-year period. And there is a small administrative fee of €1,000, and that €1,000 counts for the 3 years, so basically 333 euros at the current moment. And that is mainly for running a website, for getting the documentation, running a new system to manage all these applications. Almost everyone, we only have one part-time secretariat staff. Everyone else is volunteer. The peer reviewers are volunteer. The board's a volunteer. We're in it to help the community. We're here to help you, and hopefully you help us. So in order to keep this updated, we know that things change consistently all the time. So we have to update and change these requirements because they may need new stuff put into the core. We need to reevaluate it based on what we've seen over the last 3 years. So things change very rapidly, so we have to look into the community and try to bring that stuff back. It's a delicate balance because we want it to have that core and the low barrier so people don't say, I'm too busy for that, I can't do it. So we want to work on that. There's a balance there, so we're trying our best to do that. So the current requirements will be enacted for the 2020 to the 2022, typically, or basically we'll see later, to October 31st of the year, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. The revisions went through that process. It's basically version 2 of the CoreTrustSeal. We, through our RDA working group, pulled back information for the community, looked at what things needed to be changed. We also had a lot of people in that time moving over from other certifications, so we had to work with those folks to get them moved into the CoreTrustSeal. We're seeing that rapidly happening now. So we have a revision process for this year, and we're approaching the very end of that, where we looked at the applications over the last 3 years. We went through all the applications, all the notes from those, lessons learned, challenges we had. We drafted a list of changes and additions and things that we wanted to move around within the CoreTrustSeal. We sent that out to the community. We put a survey out and allowed people to take a look at those and think about what they want to add or change. Did they like the suggestions, or did we miss the mark? Those kinds of things. We took that feedback, we incorporated the feedback into the second draft. The board reviewed that and approved that second draft. It went out to the community again for a kind of final look at it one more time, just to be sure we didn't miss anything in the community. We did a survey for that, and then once that final error check-ins, it was released, and we've just released those new standards, and we'll talk a little bit about those. So that survey, the first survey, not the second, but the first survey that we sent out, 78% accepted most all of the actual requirements. We had lots of positive feedback. That's not unusual because we basically took the information from the community, made the changes, and sent it back to the community. So you're really doing what someone said. So that validated what we're looking for. And then the comments that were in that other 22%, we took those and put them back into the version and made those changes, those that made sense, those things that were still in core, because remember, often things that people want sometimes are outside core, and that might be better suited in an ISO 16363 audit, not a CoreTrustSeal audit. So we did that, and we determined how we were going to make the changes. I'm not sure how readable this is, but there was a couple things changed. One thing that people will quickly note is that some of the requirements were consolidated and moved. They renumbered, they're changed. So we encourage people to think about the titles and not necessarily the number. So just because you're compliant with R10 now, R10 might be a little different next time. So take a look at those. We actually combined a couple of things here and moved them down under the technical infrastructure because it was getting confused. Quite often we had people answer things in the wrong place. They were doing the right thing, but they were answering it in the wrong place, and it took a lot of time. So we moved things around to make it better. So what things changed in it? One major piece that changed were the compliance levels. We made a change in order to allow us to make it very easy to do the reviews, because we felt that quite often people were using, for example, in ours, we had a level 0 or non-applicable. And it really, quite often, people would use the non-applicable when it really was applicable. And we could show them how. And once we showed them exactly why it was applicable, clearly it's, oh, yeah, you're right, I didn't understand, and now I have to go redo it. So we took that option away. And so either you're in progress or you're fully implemented, one of the two. Now, we all know that there's always change. And as you move forward from the point A to point B, when you get recertified 3 years later, we like to see those in progresses moving to implemented, and that is part of a re-review. We watch that as well. So those compliance levels are an indicator of what the actual repository thinks you're doing there. But really, when the reviewers look at it, they look at it as a holistic model. It's not a yes or no, you're in or you're out. It's more of a very holistic look at what you're doing as a repository as a whole. And that's how you're judged, not on individual, one single answer, yes or no. Another challenge we had is with the really diverse set of applicants that we were starting to see were many generalist repositories that do a little bit things different than, for example, a subject area repository. And it was sometimes very hard to see whether they were doing active preservation or just the bit level preservation, or how they fit into these levels of preservation. So much so that we've actually have a discussion paper out we released to our community to talk about these levels of preservation, active versus passive. What does it mean to do each level? There's a lot of conversations that need to be had around this. So we want to do a triage process early. We, for example, have had some people apply that were truly just a service provider. They did bit level storage, they did the IT work, and someone else did all the digital preservation. They had all of the work on the other side, but they were applying in this area, and they just weren't in scope. And once we had the conversation with them, they realized, oh, yeah, I'm not in scope. The challenge is that was 2 or 3 months later. That's too long. So what we need to do is do a triage process and go through that and have that discussion. And up front, let's talk about these levels of preservation, active versus passive, and come up with a good metric for the community to tell how we do this. We also added some clarifications. One area was the use of data versus digital objects. There is a very specific meaning that some people have around the word data, and that can change depending on which discipline you talk to, since we're a domain agnostic. So when we were talking about it, we started talking more about digital objects, and we also had alongside the use of data and metadata. So the word data is often replaced by either digital object or data and metadata in the new standard as we move forward for clarity. In addition, remember I talked about the R0, the basics of your repository, information, details about your repository. We wanted to open that up into more of a textual base so we can get more of a story where people tell us a story rather than select a type of repository. And that was very hard to maintain. I'm an XYZ type of repository. So now you're either a specialist or you're a generalist, and you can tell us about it, tell us all about it. So it's a more verbose way to do that now, and it's not as limiting as it was. And we had lots of people that really wanted to see that change. So overall, the typical changes were like structural changes. We moved a few things down, some textual changes. Most of it was updates to improve clarity and updates to maintain alignment with other things in the community. And Hervé will talk a little more about that, but as we move forward, we want to be sure the CoreTrustSeal stays core, but stays aligned with the community and our peers in this digital preservation space, because we are an integral part of that, and we want to stay relevant, and we want to work with everyone here. So some of these changes, I'm not sure you can read some of those, but this is, we've published and documented all the changes in a change log. So for example, for this R3, or the continuation of access as it used to be, it's now continuation of service. So it's more not just about can I get to the server, but what kind of service do you provide? So those are the types of a little more detail. And quite often, things like that used to be confidentiality and ethics, we've changed to legal and ethical because it applied to more of our repositories. And often some of the instructions that were in the extended guidance that you can read outside of the actual requirements, we moved that into the requirement to be sure people were looking at those extended guidance. So timeline. October 31st, we're going to put a pause on submissions. Quite honestly, we have a backlog right now. We have so many of these trying to get through the system right now. We need this pause for November and December to try to work through that backlog, as well as cut over to a new system with all these new requirements in them. So end of this year, we're going to put a pause on submission of applications, but we still want people working on the application, so when in January, when we open it back up, but that will be against the new requirements in January, not against the 2022 requirements that are ending in October 31st. So that's the transition plan as we move forward. We have published all of these, and you can take a look at the documents for all of these different links. And with that, I will turn it over to Hervé, and we'll talk a little bit more putting this in context.
Thank you very much, Bill. Plenty more context since we started. So we've got our 16 requirements. We're all in a very lucky position that we've had a lot of engagement from a lot of people over a long period of time on this. And just some of the issues that have come up that are making this still quite a complicated space to work in are that community consensus on curation and preservation levels, making sure we're supporting those generalists and specialist repositories in a really clear way, increasingly looking at the non-trustworthy digital repository types of data service, which repositories interact with and outsource to. FAIR and other things have raised the human-mediated versus machine-actionable side of the repositories and the objects and the assessments. And also, as you'll see in a moment, elaborating around the core of CoreTrustSeal, not only into things like fair data, but also there are questions around things like whether the core is sufficient and how you build up beyond that to address other issues, things like information security. So as I always ask myself, why is this so hard? It is a long process of consensus, implementation, assessment, and outcomes. And that's not just about certification, the ideal outcomes. And I guess it speaks to something that Jenny was talking about storage, and this has come up again and again. Sort of since OAIS and TDRs became a real thing, storage has moved from a challenge, which is repository specific, to kind of more or less an off-the-shelf outcome. But we've still got no guaranteed, agreed community minima, how many copies, how many media, how many locations, what backup frequency, and exactly what integrity measures. Yeah? That's a fairly basic scenario, but we still can't define those minimal acceptable criteria. So defining the trustworthy repository and trust in other data services increasingly as well is an evolving challenge to define and journey towards. But without those agreed minimal standards and without the assessment criteria, it does weaken the foundations that we have to build on and spreads the effort and the resources we've got out further. But, as I think Jenny said, nobody likes to be judged. But the attention that repositories and the repository standards are receiving at the moment is also a real opportunity. Paul will ask a question in a little while related to money, but it is all sorts of resources here. And that brings me to some of that wider context, initially with the European Open Science Cloud, which is it's kind of representative of a global trend towards consolidation, defragmentation, centralized services, networks of partnerships and outsourced services. And the European Open Science Cloud work tends to focus on fair data, findable, accessible, interoperable, arguably the thing that we're less specific on in things like the CoreTrustSeal, and also trusted repositories. And the European Open Science Cloud has acknowledged that this is a journey, that we're not there yet, so the current activities are working out where we are, where we need to be, and how we're going to get there. And preservation has been an identified lack in the first round of EOS development and the first round of EOS projects. That has been brought to the fore now, not least because of something that was led by the DPC, which is a thing called the Fair Forever report. There are loads of links in this, and we've stuck a link to stuff on my Twitter, and if you look for CoreTrustSeal community engagement, there'll be a list of all the links as well, so that everyone can see them. But generally, with the European Open Science Cloud, if you want to get something addressed, it's got to end up in the strategic research and innovation agenda. So part of that journey has started off previously by looking at things like CoreTrustSeal plus FAIR and how they interact. So this is the CoreTrustSeal 2020 to 2022 mapped to FAIR. And at some point soon, I will update that mapping and validate it through. Though the main comment that John has made is that if you want to remain fair over time, it does require preservation. And clarifying that is an activity that that's ongoing at the moment, but against a moving target. It's nice, simple. There's only 4 letters in FAIR, but there are 15 principles. Through the RDA group, there are 40+ indicators, and they're still developing different metrics and the technical tests for those things against the digital objects. And the current effort is then to look at how we move from a more general level of FAIR to what you might be seeking at a more disciplinary level per discipline. And that's, again, something that we've come up against within CoreTrustSeal. So bringing this together, you end up with assessing repositories and their objects in some kind of connected way. And I think we've already heard in ISO 16363, if you've got the documentation and you're ready, then you're ready. And CoreTrustSeal also seeks to make sure that the evidence that you need for CoreTrustSeal are the artifacts that you need for practice. So artifacts that support your practice provide evidence to demonstrate compliance. That's the idea. There shouldn't be anything on top, over and above your object data, your object metadata, your process metadata, and your business information. So inevitably, let's cut that one off. The EOSC Association, which leads the EOSC, has got advisory groups. They're looking at implementation, careers and curricula, technical challenges, metadata and data quality, and sustaining the EOSC itself over time, making that a sustainability concept. And inevitably, is this cutting off on there as well? It is, sorry about that. The EOSC Association has developed task forces all over the place to address these different issues. And luckily for you and for me, we're only really looking these ones here at the moment. Sustaining EOSC includes long-term data preservation. But inevitably, to make things even more complicated, this is broken up into a number of subtasks. So we'll simplify those slightly. And overall, it's looking to develop a vision, to look at the financial aspects, to pull together some of the roles and responsibilities in a clearer way, and to look at trustworthy digital repositories and data services network. So this is where we're at the moment. A vision for the future will be prepared, and it will output an overview and discussion paper for broad feedback of the scope and coverage of what's going on. And then there will be iterative consultation on recommendations at the European level, the national level, and the institutional level. And probably the key issue that we're facing at the moment is to ask ourselves whether, while we're looking at the finance work and the roles work, can these be aligned with a common set of cost centers and a common set of responsibilities for actions to make, to hold these things together? What are the human resources we need and what are the financial resources we need to start to pull this out? So things like the CAT, for instance, come in here in terms of looking at the roles as part of this work. And in the early part of the task force, looked carefully at some of these, the classic glossaries and definitions of terms in terms of archiving, repository preservation and curation. And to be honest, they're kind of insufficient for what they're trying to do here. A lot of those definitions are pretty internally facing, or kind of very much we know what we mean. And they're kind of an in-group, out-of-group thing. And I'll mention the ongoing work in some of the glossary stuff in a moment as well. So, can we align this with a common set of cost centers and actions? Because this does need to go beyond just storage and kind of a snapshot of curation up until the point that digital objects are considered to be fair now. Yeah? And if we're going to do an accurate evaluation of the costs of preservation, these have to be the unique costs on top of storage and snapshot curation as well. So what are the unique costs and the responsibilities of preservation itself? Specifying that to whatever level of granularity we need to build it into what is effectively a long-term investment and funding program. So these are the first of the calls to action. There are a few of these. Of course, nobody's typing these out at the moment. But CoData have taken over the CASRI terminologies, and the research data management terminology is out for review at the moment. The deadline's the end of September. The iPres community would be an ideal community to pull some of that together. John's already mentioned the CoreTrustSeal curation and preservation levels discussion paper, looking to classify these in a way that are meaningful, that we can then build that onto looking what a repository might do and what might be outsourced by another type of data service. It's a very important foundation for some of that thinking. And also my own organization, the UK Data Service, has looked at a review of the CoreTrustSeal and its applicability to kind of non-preservation services which still seek to be trustworthy, to give us some of that bigger picture of the service contingency, maybe outside preservation and outside TDRs, that pull together something like the European Open Science Cloud or any other consolidated research lifecycle and research infrastructure. This is a forum. The DPC are a pretty legendary forum as well. As I've already said, their Fair Forever port has led into this. One of those other subtasks looking at how this might be networked within the European Open Science Cloud has also got some parallel activity to start to develop a European network to look at some of these things. Ingrid Dillo, my colleague from Dance, who can't be here today, has helped push out some work on this already. The first round, the less preservation-focused round of work on the European Open Science Cloud included a project called FAIR's FAIR, which covered FAIR issues at a very general level. SHOC, the Social Science and Humanities Open Cloud, which was one of a number of kind of disciplinary level projects, and EOS Nordic, which was one of a number of regional projects. And they were all involved in providing support for CoreTrustSeal, aspiring CoreTrustSeal members, but also looking at the implications with FAIR as we saw earlier. And that resulted in a workshop, and there is now a working paper for public feedback, which is looking at how such a network under the auspices of the European Open Science Cloud might be put together. It's got a pretty wide-ranging input so far, and they're obviously looking for more. This is, to me, a fairly critical opportunity to make sure that the community such as iPres feed into what they would like to see out of this work. It's not only an opportunity for community building, it's an opportunity for recommendations and targeted research investment, apart from anything else. So they're looking for a vision and feedback to identify those community needs, and they're offering an initial framework for the next steps of development. They're accepting a range of maturity and practices that they are both certified and aspiring trustworthy digital repositories, and that no one size fits all. But one of the key things, especially in the European Open Science Cloud context here, is going beyond limited project timeframes and perspectives. Yeah? Not making recommendations for sustainability through methodologies which are themselves not necessarily sustainable. Empowering trustworthy and fair enabling repositories in the European Open Science Cloud ecosystem. This is fair enabling, not the idea that the repository is enabled, but enabling that fair data. Providing a voice for European TDRs within that Open Science Cloud. And looking to be community-led, knowledge exchange, peer-to-peer support, network spaces, and essentially continuous validation of some of those standards and practices, both from the standards development side, but also increasingly from the service provider side, including the technical repository service providers, which we're seeing more of through projects like Archiver, which you'll have seen around here over the next couple of days. So they're looking to put repositories at the core of this network. It's inclusive of domain or discipline-specific repositories, institutional repositories, regional, national, generic repositories. Engaging with existing national and international initiatives through a wide range of stakeholders, but looking at the researchers, the funders, the Open Science Cloud, but also the larger community of research data management experts. So this is supposed to be looking at full life cycle, fully integrated repositories and data services. It will be addressing some of those principles, fair, but also importantly, the trust principles and the care principles as a common framework for best practices, licensing, standardization, metadata, control vocabularies, legal and ethical compliance, and interoperability. All enormously familiar to people who come to iPres, but that iPres perspective has got an opportunity for pushing itself out through things like this into a much wider audience. And it's an area where this preservation community has got the knowledge and needs to show the leadership as well if it's going to grab the opportunities that will arise. Again, another diagram, lots of stuff. Comes down to networking and knowledge exchange, support and development, stakeholder advocacy and engagement. And looking at the framework and the next steps, this is, in terms of the CoreTrustSeal, something that was an enormous challenge, working out how you get the back and forth with the community to run roughly the right type of organization. We've got extensive guidance on exactly how we run to make sure we're running a stable service which can be both transparent in terms of its certification options, but also in terms of its governance. And John's also talking about that triage, who's in scope, who's out of scope. We've heard repeatedly about transparency. It involves a certain degree of clarity while recognizing that there is a huge amount of variation in the community. So membership, how will they run membership? Repositories, other initiatives that contribute to increasing the number of fair enabling TDRs. That will be a benchmark that the European Open Science Cloud will certainly be looking for. And how should the benefits, the conditions of membership, the structure, the application process, and the business model be run for it? And how should the governance be set up? What are its key characteristics? What expertise is needed? The existing bodies that should be engaged with to do that, and how the strategies should be developed and what roles need to be filled. So we've got as John said, just turn it back out to you. No one's going to have to read this now, but there's a huge number of opportunities for feedback at the moment. The CoreTrustSeal is always open for feedback, info@CoreTrustSeal.org. Yeah, always open for feedback. Curation and preservation levels, CoreTrustSeal applicability. We've got a network of trustworthy digital repositories draft paper out there at the moment. And the long-term digital preservation task force will also be looking to release something probably within the next 8 to 10 weeks. So it's going to be a very active time for this wider context, but one that really needs that wider input if it's going to be successful. And the last one on there is we've all got a few weeks to jump in on the co-data terminology. So for any other feedback, support, flattery, compliments, praise should be addressed directly to me. If you have any complaints, criticisms, mark them for the attention of Mr. Crabtree. And I think that brings us to the end.
Yeah, we've got about 10 minutes, just under 10 minutes. We've got feedback in the room, questions?
I'm not sure if I've just shocked everyone with too much information. It seems a bit unfair. Directly after lunch as well, I was worried about that.
Paul, oh, sorry, there's one further back, which I didn't. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, my name's Lee from the National Library of Scotland. I was thinking about flattering you before you put up the slide about flattering you. So this is genuine flattery. I'd just like to say thanks very much to CoreTrustSeal. I think you're a fantastic organisation. We're swimming in a sea of digital preservation. It's sometimes a bit choppy, and I think CTS is one of those few rocks for us to aim towards, to swim towards, to hang on to move with over time. So I'd just like to say thank you very much for that. And for anyone else who's interested in preservation, if you haven't heard of CoreTrustSeal, just go on their website and look at their criteria. It's a great exercise to try and work through that before you even think about applying to CTS. Great stuff. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and I think that raises a really good point, which is, and this has come up again and again, and it's the point of the TPC RAM as well. It's those internal discussions, yeah? Having a framework for starting an internal discussion has always been, for many members of the CoreTrustSeal board, you know, we were asked to provide an outcome for people's work, but start providing a framework for discussion which involves the right people talking to each other internally is the most invaluable part of all this.
Paul?
Okay. Couple of thoughts I had when I was looking at this. First of all, is it a short enough cycle? I mean, you've got, was it a three-year cycle, right, isn't it?
Yep.
And given the rapidity with which events are developing in this sphere and worldwide, should there be interim updates?
Okay, now I'm going to run back. So just, I want to clarify before I answer that the cycle of review for the CoreTrustSeal is 3 years. But if you get the CoreTrustSeal, that will also last for 3 years.
Think about the review cycle.
Yeah. So you'll think about more about the review cycle than the revision of the requirements, are you?
Both. Things
Okay.
change.
So,
we need to react.
So in terms of the requirements themselves, it's a compromise between people who'd experienced the rather longer and slower ISO review cycle for reviewing those ISO standards, which can fall behind, but also providing something that was, thank you very much, the rock that people could try and swim towards without feeling that there's a constant moving target. Now there's 16 requirements. We did consult at the time what the period of review should be through the Research Data Alliance and everything else. There are terms and conditions. For instance, if you were no longer able to do something, theoretically, you should be contacting the CoreTrustSeal to say that the situation has changed. We know of one situation where a repository has been put at risk, and there will be mechanisms for which to withdraw that. In terms of doing more than that just within CoreTrustSeal, I'd be concerned that you weren't offering people a stable enough reference point. There are requirements which will last for 3 years. There is extended guidance, which if situations change over that 3 years, we can update those to an extent. But I think if you're, I know from my organization, if I'm getting CoreTrustSeal, it's 3 years. Yeah, it provides a certain degree of stability and everything else. But I think it raises a very interesting question about overall transparency and withdrawal of that certification. Yeah, and we know that at least one of the ISO 16363s is no longer in a position to hold that certification. So I would say that registering your status with a registry like v3.0 and increasing the mechanisms by which you could be transparent about the services you offer and more specific about having to be honest and open every time one of those services is at risk, that might be a mechanism to do that and add an extra check and balance to the process. Does that sound reasonable?
Ish.
I would also add, too, that the certification or the CoreTrustSeal is given to you by the peers, right? But as soon as you get it, you're not done, right? For the next 3 years, you know what you're going to be doing? You're going to be reviewing other people. So you're going to be helping other people, and other people are going to be showing you how they're doing better than you are. So you're not static. You're not sitting there waiting to get the requirements for 3 years to come down to you. You're actively participating in the community, and you're making the changes that will happen in 3 years now. So each year, you should be reviewing multiple archives and looking at what they do, and they may be doing things now that you didn't do 2 years ago, and as a responsible repository, if I can say that, you're looking at what you're doing and saying, hey, we need to keep up, right? And then when 3 years from now, when the new requirements come out, they're probably going to incorporate some of those things that have been discovered. Guess what? Just like Jessica said, your documentation will be done. You would have already done it because you're actively working. And that's the difference between active preservation and passive, stick it in a place and let someone else deal with it. And as long as it fits the rules today, I'm okay with it. I'm never going to look at it again. But if you're working actively in this community, then you are staying on top of things, but you still have that 3-year stability that Hervé is talking about for organizations and things to trust on. And that's just my perspective.
I'll call up Paul afterwards for more detail on what he's thinking. He's obviously got a plan.
Are there any other questions? I've got a little niggle I'd like to raise. No other questions?
We've got a couple more minutes. So
Okay, it's a
unless
little
anyone else out there? No, I think
I'll go for it. Legal and ethical norms. That's stuck in my gall somewhat. And what are legal and ethical norms? That's such a broad brush.
Yeah.
I know it's probably deliberately a broad brush.
Yes.
Yeah.
But if we're trying to be ethical, we ought to have some form of standard that the community agrees upon.
Okay,
and
so
referenced.
And that's what I think I had a slide I think that literally said, "Why is this so hard?" And it's something that comes up quite a lot. Yeah. We've got a similar thing with disciplinary versus generalist repositories, yeah? Right? If you want to be domain agnostic, what you need to do is you need to trust people to come out and say, this is the domain or discipline that we serve, and this is how we serve them, yeah? You can't do that at a per disciplinary level any more than you can look at a per country legislative situation or a per discipline ethical scenario or anything else. This is about demonstrating that based on the people you are trying to serve, that the evidence is out there, that you understand that ethical environment and that you have the processes to follow that. And doing that at a core level is challenging, but doing it, explicitly at, say, a national level is a huge task. One which I would love to see. I'd love to see a social science ethical registry. I'd love to see a UK research data legal registry, just to take some of the load off for people who are repeating the same effort over and over again to try and keep this together. There's some real opportunities for doing things there. But going back to the transparency issue, if you decide to fib about your coverage of any of these issues, you will be doing it in front of your peers. And for me, having that transparency out there is not, I mean, you know, I don't want to be called out by my peers, and that's the other side of the coin of the transparency of CoreTrustSeal, which is that my peers are there for me to interact with and steal ideas from. Yeah, and I've done that a huge amount over the course of it. So I think it comes down to openness and transparency, but almost, you pick legal and ethical, and they're a really good example, yeah. But so many of these examples in here are hugely challenging to do anything but broad brushstrokes. So what you're asking for is a series of statements which demonstrate your understanding of the issues within your context and how you address those issues for the people that you claim to serve, I think.
Right, I think we'll have to call it a day there. Maybe just if anyone had any questions going back to the previous things, maybe prompted by that last one, there might just be time for that. No, in which case I think it's on to the break next, and so that's half an hour, and then on to the final session of the day. Thanks again.
Brilliant. Thanks everyone. Cheers.